Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. The American President Barack Obama says he wants to obliterate ISIS without the help of Iran or Assad, and he doesn't want to offend the region's Sunnis. This is a tall order. Are there any other ways in dealing with ISIS? To discuss this and more, we're joined by Saad Jawad. He's a senior visiting fellow at the Middle East Center, London School of Economics. And we also have Kamal Alam. He's a fellow for Middle East Regional Defense and Security at the Institute for Statecraft, an advisor to the British military on Syrian affairs. And sitting here with me in Moscow is Mark Sloboda. He is an international affairs and security analyst. If I could go to Professor Jawad, how would you characterize the approach that Mr. Obama has and his allies in dealing with ISIS? Because in American foreign policy, it seems, since the end of the Cold War at least, Washington just only sees nails, so it just acts like one big hammer.
Well, Washington also only makes problems and unsettled areas and leave. This we have seen in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and of course we are seeing now with Syria and Iraq. I think his approach of concentrating on bombing ISIS is not affecting ISIS that much. Yes, it is slowing its advances, but it has not removed it from areas where it is very well entrenched, like Mosul, like Hasaka, or Aleppo, around Aleppo, Raqqa, and other areas. He claims that there the American military claim that there were 4,100 stories against ISIS, but ISIS advancing against areas like Ain al-Arab in the north, and the Turkish army is alarmed of these moves. I don't think this policy will be successful unless he comes to the conclusion that without the help of the Syrian army and
I want to go down that path in a second. Exactly. It's where I want to go, because I want to talk about alternatives. If I can go to Kamal Alam, it seems, looking at Afghanistan all the way to the present, and we have everything in between, we have Iraq and we have Libya, it's always the same policy, it's just a different target.
That seems to be correct. In Afghanistan, actually, in the first 2 years of the war, between 2001 to 3, the Americans were relatively successful because their airstrikes they carried out were then coordinated with the locals, the Northern Alliance. So they were very successful in overthrowing the Taliban within 2 years, and there was no Taliban up until 2004. But the problem was that then they made it into a nation building and making Afghanistan into a state. So as soon as they moved from fighting the Taliban into state building, they failed. And that's, I think, and then the Iraq war started, and similarly in Iraq, it didn't work. And currently, I think they've gone for the wrong allies. I think the airstrikes already we've seen in the first week, there's been backlash in Saudi Arabia against the Saudi Air Force. They've received death threats from within Saudi Arabia, even the photo opportunity of pictures of the Saudi prince and the Emirati female pilots, they haven't really worked. So yes, it seems to be more of the same, going in with the wrong allies on the ground or picking, the wrong regional players as well.
Mark, if I can go to you. This is what ISIS wants. This is exactly what they want Washington to do. Again, these players on the ground are writing the playbook. ISIS wants to turn this into a Western crusade against Islam, and they're succeeding with that narrative with people on the ground. It's amazing, obviously, that this is the way it would look on the ground, but no one in Washington seems to be able to catch on to that fact.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. We have seen an immediate reaction from the supposedly, quote-unquote, moderate rebel groups that the U.S., the West, and its Gulf state despotic allies have previously already armed, trained, and funded, at least the ones that haven't already joined the Islamic State. I mean, we're talking about Harakat, Hazam, and others, have openly condemned the airstrikes against what they call as their allies, okay? And that it is only aiding the regime, meaning the government of Syria. But more than that, I think there's also that one of the major goals of the Islamic State is the idea of this Islamic Caliphate. And part of that is getting rid of the Sykes-Picot British colonial lines, the idea that there is no division, that these borders drawn throughout the Middle East at the end of the British colonial area are artificial. And their territory stretching across Iraq and Syria is proof enough of that. But by eroding the Syrian state and sovereignty, asserting the right without the assent of the Syrian government or the Security Council to bomb willy-nilly, be it ISIS, be it Syrian infrastructure, as it appears most of the targets actually are, the United States is doing the very same thing.
It's very interesting, Mark. You're absolutely right. If I can go back to Professor Jawad, we do have this narrative coming out of ISIS is about unity, but Washington is breaking international law left and right. It broke Iraq into 3 states. No one wants to admit, but it's been broken up into 3 states. It violates the sovereignty of Syria by bombing it. Washington is acting very much in the same way that ISIS is. It's not recognizing international law. It doesn't recognize the past, and it has a very rigid ideological approach to solving this problem.
Well, as I said, the United States does what it wishes, but that they had a plan to bomb Syria before, creating the issue of the chemical weapon, and then they have failed in doing this, or failed in getting the international community approving this, or the Security Council approving this, thanks to the Russian and the Chinese veto. But now they have an opportunity to do that. I cannot understand how could they allow themselves to go into a sovereign state and bomb it and concentrate on the infrastructure of the state rather than on the ISIS forces. This is a plan, I should think, to weaken the Syrian government, weaken the Syrian regime, and hoping that their allies on the ground, like the Free Army or the other Islamic groups, which they have previously with the Gulf states supported and financed, to do the rest. But I don't think this strategy will succeed.
It's very interesting that you used the word hope. Yeah. Kamal Alam, if I could go to you, I mean, if the last 14 years have anything to do with the word hope, I'd like to know. Because, again, no matter what they do, like I started out with the program, all they do is see nails, and Washington is one big hammer. They can't seem to change their behavior, and the results are always the same. Because when we heard Professor Jawad I was not thinking of Syria as he was speaking, I was thinking of Libya. Just destroy the place. No state building, it's state destruction.
Absolutely, that's true. And, with regards to ISIS and the campaigns, a lot of voices coming out from Britain, initially were trying to tell the Americans, you've got to work with Assad. And Assad's army is one of the few armies in the region which is not sectarian. A lot of the higher command are Sunnis, Christians, Druze. It's a proper professional army. Whilst if you look at the other armies in the region, like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Bahrain, you can't even join the army if you don't come from a particular sect or a particular family. And the professionalism of the Syrian military is one of the reasons it hasn't collapsed. And it seems to be the only army that can tackle ISIS. And, the fact that America won't work with it properly means you're just exasperating the problem, because you might take out a few useless Humvees and a couple of, guys on the backs of pickup trucks. But the problem is going to remain there as long as the backers in the region remain there.
Mark, I want to go to you because what we just heard from Kamal about the military, the way it's being projected in Western media that ISIS is just the meanest, baddest, or worstest, whatever you want, a superlative, but it's because everyone else in the region is weak, just for the very reasons that Kamal just said to us about the militaries.
Yeah, it's not only ISIS, and I think we're allowed a little bit more context here on the Voice of Russia than we might get in the Western media. ISIS is not simply a fundamentalist Sunni Wahhabist death cult, although there's certainly obviously a part of what they are. A large part that has been left out of most of the discussion on ISIS is that there are a number of former Ba'athist generals. 8 out of 10 of their generals are former Ba'athists and they are by nature secular. for the most part, at least their past. Most of them were in U.S. prisons in Iraq, many of them tortured.
So they have motivation.
They have motivation, and many of them claim that there they found religion. But also we see that where ISIS has been extremely successful, there has been a power vacuum. They have been extremely successful in areas where there is a Sunni majority that is at odds with both the former government of al-Maliki in Baghdad, and that has been part of the Syrian rebellion in the east of Syria. So they haven't really won any battlefield victories of any consequence, right? They're not a super effective fighting force, although these generals, and these former Ba'athist officers do give them an ability to actually hold territory and start to rebuild society in Mosul and other areas that they have taken. But they're not an effective fighting force. They've only gone where the population is, at least to some extent, welcoming of them, and there's a power vacuum. But if we take a look at the other hand on these Syrian rebels, the United States now says it needs to train up 15,000 Syrian moderate rebels, right, to defeat ISIS. Now, this is never mind the fact that the U.S., its despotic Gulf state allies, Turkey and others, have spent the last several years pumping tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into building up a moderate Syrian rebel force, supposedly, at least the ones that haven't already joined the Islamic State. And what do they have to show for it? Absolutely nothing. So, again, this is going back to Einstein's definition of insanity. How many times do we have to repeat the same thing?
Professor Jawad, if we can go back to you in London, one of the things that I find quite interesting is that, echoing what Mark Sloboda said, they want to train up these quote-unquote moderates. But if we look back in Iraq, for many, many years, and tens of billions of dollars was spent on training that military and security apparatus, and look what they did. They took off their uniforms and dropped their guns.
25 billion.
25 billion, thank you, Mark. Why would we expect it would be any different with this quote-unquote mythical group of moderates in Syria?
Well, the figure I have is 70 billion, just to make some corrections.
Okay, all right. We can turn this into a bidding and auctioning war. It's okay with me.
$70 billion spent.
I stand corrected. I like that number better.
Yeah, spent on the new Iraqi army, but you know what the result is. The fact is they have no intention to build a real army. This is a fact where everybody now is aware of. And by saying that they are going to train 15,000 people, they are only saying that we are going to prolong the struggle in Syria for longer and longer time. Of course, France declared the same by saying that they are supplying the opposition with the new armaments. Turkey is turning a blind eye, and Gulf states and Israel are also arming these people, but they are not realizing that all they have done has done nothing real on the ground, and the Syrian army is still standing, and Assad is still in power, and he is resisting, and he is capable of regaining some of the lands. I think their intention is not to put an end, because how could you support a group while you bomb the other group which is in alliance with the other group? I mean, Al-Nusra and Al-Hur, they were alliances before, until ISIS claimed some more victories than them. And ISIS, everybody knows, was armed and supported by the other different allies of the Free Army and the others. So I think this policy is a sort of comical or sarcastic way of fighting terrorism in this area.
Kamal, if I can go to you, I find the cynicism coming out of Washington just quite galling, because we even have a sitting president that is essentially passing on to the man that will, or woman that will follow him in the White House, this problem. Barack Obama is it will be dealt with after I leave. I mean, I've never heard an American president, if I could use an American metaphor, fumble the ball and saying, I'm not going to be held responsible for what we have created, the United States and its allies created in the region by creating the circumstances and providing the money and even training for the creation of ISIS.
And also, astonishingly, just 2 days ago, he blamed the intelligence chiefs in America, and there's been a backlash in America against that, where he just passed the buck and said, look, it's the intelligence community that has let us down. We didn't see this coming. But in general, we even saw this in Libya with the Benghazi episode, where you have a U.S. ambassador that was killed, And Obama just, took leave of absence, and he's been refusing to tackle the issue within his own party and within the military circles. If you have a sitting ambassador that's killed in Libya and Obama just goes and doesn't deal with the issue. And it very much remains to be seen that what will happen in the next 2 years of his presidency with the region in such a turmoil. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, it's quite interesting for a man that got a Nobel Peace Prize for doing nothing. He has bombed 7 predominantly Muslim countries while in office. Mark, you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very good point, I think. But we have to look. It's not actually only the Obama administration. We have an entire history of whether we're talking 9/11, the events that occurred in Iraq, the events that occurred in Libya, the failures in Afghanistan, and now Syria as well. Every time the buck is passed to the intelligence community saying that they're at fault. But amazingly, no one is ever held accountable. There is no drastic reform of the intelligence community, certainly not of the CIA that has undergone. There's no top officials being fired as a result of anything. So I really have to doubt the sincerity of this.
If I can add to that, if I can add to what Mark is saying, the same people that are advising Western audiences on major news outlets like BBC and CNN, and I would even say Al Jazeera, they're the same people that got us into the mess in Iraq, and no one got fired. No one lost their job.
I think we're beating around the bush here a little bit, and I just want to go right to the heart of the matter. ISIS is the direct result, it is of American backlash. It is a backlash from repeated United States interventions, not only in Iraq, but in Syria as well. It is a result of a failed policy to try to overthrow the government of Assad. We've seen even the Washington Post doing headlines saying that the people, ISIS, that were bombing today, we just finished training in Jordan. Yep. So this is, again, I don't necessarily think that the U.S. intentionally created the ISIS threat, but it's a result of their failed ideological policies for the Middle East that has gone from one administration, from one party to the next, and it's a failure of accountability within the U.S. government itself.
Professor Jawad, let's talk about Syria and Iran. Logically speaking, if we were all to step back and look at what's going on right now as we speak, it should be the U.S. teaming up with Assad, with the Iranians.
Hezbollah.
And Hezbollah, yes. It's the Iranians and Hezbollah, the ones that are doing the fighting, the real fighting against ISIS, really, on the ground. But that's being logic. But politics isn't going to work that way. And, of course, Israel has one of the largest militaries in the world, but it's doing nothing except for undermine the stability and sovereignty of Syria.
Well, the states you have mentioned have different objectives, different intentions. To tell you the truth, I believe personally that the Iranians are not totally unsatisfied with what the Americans are doing now with ISIS, because as you may know that they were about to occupy Erbil, Suleimania and Yala, and they were about to be on the borders with Iran, and this was a very big threat to the Iranians at that moment. And what the Americans did, and the bombing has at least ended this advancement and secured, between two brackets, the Iranian borders. But their main concern is that the ISIS presence in Iraq have created a buffer zone, between two brackets, between Iran and Syria. They are not allowed now to freely supply Syria with what they used to do through Iraq before. And this is their main concern now. They are trying to do something to keep the link with the Syrians. But I'm sure that as an Arab, I see that this as an Israeli objectives. The Israelis do not want the Iranians and Hezbollah to get involved in the fighting, because this will keep President Assad in power and the threat to his regime. And as you may know, President Bashar al-Assad is a great ally of Syria and Hezbollah. And Hezbollah and Iran are very strongly against, came very strongly against the Israeli state. So this is the complication. And eventually, I am sure, the Americans and the Israelis will regret what they are doing, because no matter what happens, even in the worst scenario, if ISIS and the other Islamic groups succeed in removing Bashar al-Assad, the Israelis will have another fanatical Islamic groups on their borders, and they will not be able to to fight against them, as they have failed against Hamas and against Hezbollah. And in the long run, I think the Israeli and the American strategy is very, I should say, stupid and short-sighted.
Oh, and I'm sure the Saudis will, and their
Of
Gulf
course, the
friends
Gulf
will regret
states
it as well.
but they are not that effective as the Americans and the Israelis.
Kamal, it's really interesting because there's been a lot of commentary that Iran has been shut out of this process because Iran could be a very important player. In many ways, if we look at the region's history, and say in this century, it would be a great opportunity for some kind of rapprochement between the House of Saud and the Islamic Republic. But we know that isn't going to happen. But on the other hand, Tehran is watching, just as what we heard Professor Jawad say, look at the Americans and their allies make all these horrific mistakes. I mean, they're really hurting themselves. The Iranians are just sitting back and watching it. Why should they get involved? Why should they bail out the U.S. and its allies after at least 15 years of horrific policy in that region?
I think the Iranians are in a great, position where they can just sit back and watch what's going on, not just in Iraq, but also Afghanistan, where the Iranians initially helped bring Karzai into power with the Bonn Agreement. And, the government at the time of President Khatami helped the Americans in the West to bring stability to Afghanistan, only for them then to be ignored and kicked aside. And, and again, as we see the mess in Afghanistan with the Afghan army in retreat and is as much of a joke as the Iraqi army, you just see the Iranians, I think, better just to sit and watch. Interestingly, the British military here, two former defense chiefs, General Richards and General Dannett, both have come out publicly and said that we should not only support Assad, but also work with Iran, because in the long run, they work out to be better allies in bringing stability to the region. Also, the former head of MI6, Sir Richard Dalev, openly said that, the West, it's about time at least Britain should start distancing itself from some of the Gulf Arab regimes which have led to more instability, and rather work with Iran that can bring stability to the region.
Well, another country, if I can go to Mark, another country that's being ignored here that could play a very important positive role is the Russian Federation. Yeah. But because of the situation in Ukraine and other issues related to a relationship Russia has with the West, that's probably not going to happen. That's a real shame.
Yeah, I think the real question here is American motives, and I don't think that what's going on in Ukraine is entirely disconnected from the U.S. renewed interest to overthrow the government of Syria. If we take a look at this fictitious group that anonymous sources in the U.S. government reported on Khorasan, which just days after they introduced it anonymously to the Western press, the same anonymous government officials then backtracked from and said, it wasn't a threat.
It sounds like a cough syrup to me.
Well, it is actually a historical term. It just has nothing to do with this fictitious group that they created. What is the U.S.'s real goals with ISIS? Are they really interested in ISIS for itself, or are they interested in managing it and using it to leverage out the Syrian government? Because I think that's the real fear. No one likes ISIS, except possibly even the Gulf state despots. They certainly don't want them returning home and carrying on their business there, even if they support them elsewhere. They've declared war on Russia. They're a threat to China through the Xinjiang. They're a threat to Iraq, to Iran, to Syria. They're a threat to everyone. But the question is, what are the U.S.'s real motives? Are they really interested in going after ISIS? No, I don't think so. The U.S.'s duplicity with this whole Khorasan, they're again announcing the recreation of a Syrian rebel army.
Though a few months ago, we were told it was fanciful, that they wouldn't happen.
They wouldn't happen. And all of this says that the U.S. isn't serious about tackling ISIS. If they were serious about tackling ISIS, they would put pressure on the Gulf state allies to stop the flow of jihadists, funds, and arm into Syria. They would do the same thing with Turkey and get the border closed, which gives ISIS and these other jihadist groups, because now Jabhat al-Nusra has declared an alliance with ISIS as a result of this bombing, where previously they were fighting each other. They would close the sources of funding jihads and supplies to ISIS through what are the U.S.'s allies now, and they would go to the serious players on the ground that can put troops on the ground to fight ISIS, and that is the Syrian government, the PKK, which is still recognized as a terrorist group by the United States, and the Iranians, because there is no Syrian moderate rebel army. There is, despite the 25 to 70 billion that's been spent to create it, there is no unified Iraqi army capable of tackling. And the fact that they will refuse to even talk to Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, the PKK to actually deal with ISIS on the ground, says that the U.S. is not interested in wiping out ISIS. They are only interested in managing them and using them to their geopolitical
there's something
advantage.
to that. If I can go back to Professor Jawad in London, in looking at what's been going on in the region since the illegal invasion of Iraq, it's not hard to come to the conclusion that there are certainly people in Washington and maybe in other Western capitals, but certainly in Washington, that just want chaos in the region and try to manage the chaos, to move the chaos around, to change political alliances. It's constant manipulation and trying to determine certain political outcomes in the region, and they can't get it. They just keep trying again, and ISIS coming out, quote unquote, coming out of the blue. Well, a lot of us watching all of the money going into the region and the arms and the militarization of the protest movement in Syria could have predicted this. We didn't need the intelligence community at all. But there are elements in Washington, and I'm thinking of the neocons, they just like the chaos.
Well, this is what I said at the beginning, start from the beginning. I think I said that the United States is ready to create problems without finding any solution to them. I have said that, and a lot of people also said that right from the beginning, that the Americans went into Iraq for two objectives. First, the security of Israel, and second, oil. Now, that's why they were not interested in anything else. And they have neglected the public opinion. They have neglected all advices about coming out against the regime of the late President Saddam Hussein, destroying Iraq. But they have done what they did, and they have left without any sign of a new Iraqi state being built. So this is their main intention. And if you look at the recent problem, the Iraqi army was defeated in Mosul. Mosul was taken, and Tikrit was taken. A big part of Al-Anbar was taken, and all these areas create form more than the third of Iraq. But the American administration did not move a bit to stop this threat to the state they have created and with which they have a security and strategic treaty. They only moved, or they were only pushed to be moved by what happened to the Iraqi Kurdistan area, because they regard this area, as the Israelis do, as the base for them to be kept intact or kept secure. And that's why they moved into the area only when they have seen the threat coming to the Kurdish regional area. But before that, they have seen nothing of the threats of ISIS or of any other extremist groups in Iraq or in Syria.
Kamal, where do we go here? We're almost out of time here. Are we going to see a real serious international effort? Because Washington keeps talking about this coalition of the willing. If it's anything, it's the coalition of the reluctant, and it's really just a fig leaf. It's just going to be American bombing, and a few NATO allies will throw in a couple of planes themselves.
Yes, that's true. I mean, it seems like the current strategy, it's not going to go anywhere, and this is why I think even, at least in this country, in England, where the defense chiefs have clearly said this is not going to work and we should reach out to Assad. Otherwise, there's just no point. It's like, why use, whether it's a few missiles or even a few special forces to take out 3 guys in a village or 1 oil field burning when the actual problem is not going to go away. So, exactly. As a result, unless there's a massive strategic shift to bring in Iran and Russia to solve the solution, it's just not going to work. And all the more so, as I briefly said before, Russia and Iran helped NATO in Afghanistan. If Russia hadn't helped NATO, through the northern corridor through Central Asia, NATO couldn't have done anything to stabilize Afghanistan. So, and now we see the new Afghan presidents are actually reaching out to Russia to help build Afghanistan. Despite of all of NATO's $1 trillion going into Afghanistan, the Afghans still trust the Russians more, and the Iranians. So that's a good indication where someone really needs to think carefully how to work with Russia and deal with them to bring stability into the region.
If I may jump in, Peter, just
real quick.
Yeah, 2 comments. I think the Russians should not wait for the Americans or the others to interfere in that. They should approach these governments in Syria, more in Iraq and more in Iran, and to create something in favor of the region. The second thing, to the best of my knowledge, I think the Americans are trying to talk to the Syrians indirectly through the British people, the British government, and they are doing this secretly, just for the information.
Okay, well, I hope you're right. I want to thank both my guests in London and my guest here, Mark Slobodka, in Moscow. You've been listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stay with the Voice of Russia. Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. The American President Barack Obama says he wants to obliterate ISIS without the help of Iran or Assad, and he doesn't want to offend the region's Sunnis. This is a tall order. Are there any other ways in dealing with ISIS? To discuss this and more, we're joined by Saad Jawad. He's Senior Visiting Fellow at the Middle East Center, London School of Economics. And we also have Kamal Alam. He's a Fellow for Middle East Regional Defense and Security at the Institute for Statecraft and advisor to the British military on Syrian affairs. And sitting here with me in Moscow is Mark Slobodka. He is an international affairs and security analyst. If I could go to Professor Jawad, how would you characterize the approach that Mr. Obama has and his allies in dealing with ISIS? Because in American foreign policy, it seems, since the end of the Cold War at least, Washington
he comes to the conclusion that without the help of the Syrian army and
I want to go down that path in a second. Exactly. It's where I want to go, because I want to talk about alternatives. If I can go to Kamal Alam, it seems, looking at Afghanistan all the way to the present, and we have everything in between, we have Iraq and we have Libya, it's always the same policy, it's just a different target.
I know that seems to be correct. In Afghanistan, actually, in the first 2 years of the war, between 2001 to 3, the Americans were relatively successful because their airstrikes
very well entrenched, like Mosul, like Hasaka, or Aleppo, around Aleppo, Raqqa, and other areas. He claims that the American military claim that there were 4,100 stories against ISIS, but ISIS advancing again against areas like Ain al-Arab in the north, and the Turkish army is alarmed of these moves. I don't think this policy will be successful unless he
and just only sees nails, so it just acts like one big hammer.
Well, Washington also only makes problems and unsettled areas and leave. This we have seen in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and of course we are seeing now with Syria and Iraq. I think his approach of concentrating on bombing ISIS is not affecting ISIS that much. Yes, it is slowing its advances, but it has not removed it from areas where it is